The biting wind cut through the streets as Evelyn Walker pulled her tattered coat tighter around her frail body. The city had long stopped caring about people like her, those who had served, sacrificed, and been forgotten. Once a proud Marine, she had spent the last few years surviving on the streets, her only company the ghosts of memories that haunted her mind. That night, exhaustion weighed heavily on her. She hadn't eaten in over a day, and the bone-chilling cold made every step feel heavier. Desperate for shelter, she spotted an abandoned storefront with a recessed entryway. It wasn't much, but at least it would block the wind for a few hours. She huddled in the corner, pulling a thin blanket over herself, her body trembling from the cold. She had barely closed her eyes when the blinding flash of a flashlight startled her. "Hey, you can't sleep here!" A gruff voice barked. Evelyn squinted up at the security guard standing over her. "Please," she croaked, her throat dry. "Just for a little while. I'll be gone before morning." The guard scowled. "No exceptions. Get up!" She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled beneath her. Before she could steady herself, two uniformed police officers approached. "We've had complaints about vagrants trespassing," one of them said, eyeing her with disinterest. I wasn't hurting anyone," Evelyn murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. But the officers had already decided. One grabbed her arm. "You're coming with us." As the cold steel of the handcuffs clamped around her wrists, Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat. She had once fought for this country, yet here she was, treated as a criminal for simply trying to survive, and she had no idea that this arrest would change everything. The harsh glare of the police car's lights illuminated Evelyn's weary face as she was escorted through the empty streets. Her wrists ached from the cold steel of the handcuffs, but what hurt more was the humiliation pressing down on her like a heavy weight. People walked by, some glancing her way with pity, others with disgust. One officer, a tall man with a tight-lipped frown, barely looked at her as he opened the car door. "Get in," he ordered. Evelyn hesitated. Every fiber of her being wanted to fight back, to remind them that she had once worn a uniform just like theirs. But she had learned the hard way, arguing wouldn't help. So with a deep sigh, she stepped into the car, her heart pounding. As they drove toward the station, the younger officer in the passenger seat kept looking at her in the rearview mirror. "You a regular around here?" he asked. Evelyn stared out the window, watching the city blur past. "No," she finally muttered. "Just looking for a warm place." The officer scoffed. "Plenty of shelters." She clenched her jaw. "They're full. Always are." Silence settled in the car. The older officer sighed. "Well, maybe this will teach you to find a legal place next time." Evelyn bit her tongue. She had heard it all before, the assumption that homelessness was a choice, that people like her were just lazy or reckless. They didn't know her story. When they reached the station, she was pulled out of the car and led through the doors. Officers at desks glanced up as she entered, some barely giving her a second look. Others smirked, used to seeing people like her come and go. A female officer approached, holding a clipboard. "Name?" Evelyn hesitated before answering. "Evelyn Walker." The officer jotted it down, then asked, "Date of birth?" As Evelyn answered, she saw a flicker of something in the woman's eyes. Recognition? But before she could process it, the officer set the clipboard down. "Let's get you processed." Little did Evelyn know, her name was about to send shockwaves through the entire station. The officer at the desk stared at Evelyn's name on the clipboard, her brow furrowing. She tapped her pen against the paper, hesitation flickering in her eyes. Evelyn noticed the shift. It wasn't the usual indifference she had come to expect. This officer recognized her. "Evelyn Walker," the woman repeated, as if trying to confirm something. Evelyn straightened slightly. "Yeah. That a problem?" The officer blinked, then shook her head. "No, just, you served, didn't you?" Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting that. Most people didn't look at her and see a veteran. They saw the tattered coat, the unkempt hair, the weight of exhaustion in her eyes. "Marine Corps," she said cautiously. 12 years. A murmur spread through the room. A few officers turned their heads, some exchanging glances. The recognition was growing. One officer, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, leaned forward from his desk. "Walker, didn't you—" He stopped himself, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more serious. Evelyn remained silent, but her mind was racing. They remembered her. Not as a homeless woman, not as some trespasser, but as something else. The female officer cleared her throat, trying to regain composure. All right, let's just get through the paperwork. Evelyn clenched her fists. She had spent years being invisible. Now suddenly, her name meant something again. But what did it mean to them? And why did it feel like the air in the room had just changed? The tension in the precinct was growing. Officers whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Evelyn as if she were a ghost from another life. The female officer who had taken her name hesitated before continuing. You're being charged with trespassing on private property. You were found sleeping in the back alley of Harper & Co. Evelyn exhaled slowly. She had been through this before, swept up, given a citation, released back onto the streets. But this time, something was different. A deep voice cut through the murmurs. Evelyn Walker, a tall officer, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable, stepped forward. His name tag read Lieutenant Harris. He studied her, his eyes filled with something between recognition and disbelief. I thought you were. His words trailed off. Evelyn met his gaze with quiet defiance. Gone? She finished for him. Yeah, a lot of people did. The room grew eerily silent. More officers had turned to listen. Harris let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temple. She doesn't belong here, he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for his colleagues to hear. The female officer hesitated. Sir, she was found trespassing. Harris turned to her sharply. Do you even know who she is? Evelyn tensed. She didn't like this. She didn't like being the center of attention, especially when her past was about to be dragged into the light. The whispers around the precinct grew louder. Some younger officers looked confused, while the older ones exchanged uneasy glances. Get the court date set, Harris finally said. This isn't something we can handle here. Evelyn's stomach tightened. Court. That meant standing in front of a judge, defending herself once again. But this time, something told her it wasn't going to be just another case. It was going to be a reckoning. Evelyn sat in the holding cell, her hands clasped together as she stared at the cold concrete floor. The sounds of officers moving around outside barely registered in her mind. She had been in places like this before, but this time there was a shift in the air. Something was different. The name Evelyn Walker had stirred something in Lieutenant Harris, and now the entire precinct was buzzing. Officers who had once ignored her were now stealing glances, murmuring to each other. She didn't like it. A loud clank echoed as the cell door opened. A younger officer, clearly hesitant, motioned for her to step out. You have a court hearing tomorrow, he informed her. Judge Matthews will preside. Evelyn lifted an eyebrow. Matthews. She had heard that name before. As she stepped out of the holding cell, she noticed a group of older officers standing near the desk. Their faces were pale, their expressions tense. One of them, an older sergeant, muttered under his breath, "This is going to be bad." Evelyn knew exactly what they were talking about. She wasn't just some homeless woman off the streets. She had a past that many of these officers would rather forget. As she was led through the precinct, she caught a glimpse of Lieutenant Harris standing by his office. He was rubbing his temples, deep in thought, as if trying to make sense of something. Before she was taken out of sight, he called out, "Evelyn." She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. "Does he know?" Harris asked, his voice quiet but firm. Evelyn's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "He will," she said, and with that, she was escorted away, leaving behind a room full of stunned officers. Tomorrow in court, everything would change. The next morning, Evelyn was led into the courthouse, her wrists shackled in front of her. The courtroom was already filled with murmuring voices. Spectators, reporters, and even a few off-duty officers had shown up, their curiosity piqued by the unusual case of a homeless veteran being brought to trial for trespassing. As she was guided to her seat, Evelyn could feel the weight of countless eyes on her. Some were filled with pity, others with confusion. But a few, especially those who recognized her name, held something else entirely: fear. Judge Matthews entered, his gavel slamming down to call the room to order. The murmurs quieted instantly. He was an older man, stern and no-nonsense, the kind of judge who rarely showed emotion. But the moment he glanced at the case file in front of him and saw her name, his expression shifted. A flicker of recognition, a twitch in his jaw. Evelyn caught it instantly. He remembered. The prosecutor, a young, overconfident lawyer, stood up to present the case. Your Honor, the defendant was found trespassing on private property. She refused to leave when asked, which resulted in her arrest. Judge Matthews barely acknowledged him. His gaze was locked on Evelyn, a silent battle waging in his mind. Ms. Walker, he finally spoke, his voice measured. Do you have legal representation? Evelyn smiled slightly. I don't need one. The crowd shifted uneasily. What kind of person walks into court without a lawyer? The prosecutor scoffed. Your Honor, if she refuses legal counsel, that's her choice. We'd like to proceed. Judge Matthews hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he asked, Are you the same Evelyn Walker from— I am, she interrupted. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The reporters scribbled furiously. The officers in the back stood rigid. The prosecutor's confidence wavered. Wait, what's going on here? Judge Matthews exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around his gavel. This just became a very different case. The entire room tensed. Something big was about to be revealed, and nobody was ready for it. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The prosecutor flipped through his papers, suddenly unsure of himself. The judge's face was unreadable, but the weight of history loomed in his eyes. Evelyn sat calmly, her hands resting on the table. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid. She was waiting. The judge finally spoke, his voice lower this time. Miss Walker, are you the same Evelyn Walker who served in the United States Marine Corps? Another gasp rippled through the crowd. A woman in the back covered her mouth. A few officers exchanged glances. The energy in the room shifted from curiosity to outright disbelief. The prosecutor frowned. I don't see how that's relevant, Your Honor. Judge Matthews shot him a sharp look. That's because you don't understand who she is. The young lawyer hesitated, flipping through his case file again, but it was useless. He had assumed she was just another homeless person. He had no idea who he was up against. Evelyn finally leaned forward, her voice even. Yes, Your Honor. I served for 23 years, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, and before that, she paused, locking eyes with him. Before that, I worked in military intelligence. The entire room held its breath. Judge Matthews exhaled, rubbing his temples. I thought so. The prosecutor shook his head. So what? That doesn't change the fact that she was trespassing. The judge ignored him. Instead, he turned to the officers standing in the back of the room. Who arrested Ms. Walker? Officer Riggs stepped forward reluctantly. I did, Your Honor. The judge's gaze hardened. Did you bother to check her background before treating her like a common criminal? Riggs opened his mouth, then closed it. The truth was, he hadn't. He had seen an old woman in ragged clothes and assumed she was just another nobody. Now it was clear, she wasn't just anybody. Judge Matthews sighed. Miss Walker, do you have anything to say for yourself? Evelyn smiled faintly. I just want to know why a veteran who served her country for decades was treated like she didn't belong in it. Her words sent chills down everyone's spine. The real trial was just beginning. The weight of Evelyn's words settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. Even the prosecutor, who had been so confident moments ago, looked uneasy. Judge Matthews adjusted his glasses, his expression grave. Ms. Walker, I want to hear your side of the story. What were you doing on that property? Evelyn folded her hands together. I wasn't trespassing. I was visiting a place that used to be mine. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Even the officers looked confused. The prosecutor scoffed. That's ridiculous. The property belongs to the city. Evelyn tilted her head. Does it? The judge glanced at her curiously. Explain. Evelyn took a deep breath. 30 years ago, that building wasn't abandoned. It was a shelter for veterans, a place where we could go when we had nowhere else. I helped build it with my own hands. Gasps echoed through the room. The prosecutor looked through his documents, but there was nothing about this in the case file. Evelyn continued. After I retired, I worked with organizations to make sure veterans had a safe space. That shelter saved lives, until one day, the funding disappeared. The judge leaned forward. You're saying the city shut it down? Evelyn nodded. Yes, they called it budget cuts, but we all knew the truth. They didn't care. They turned their backs on us. The room was silent. The officers who had arrested her looked at each other, shifting uncomfortably. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that you were on city property without permission. Evelyn met his eyes. I wasn't trespassing. I was remembering. That building wasn't just concrete and walls. It was home. Judge Matthews sighed deeply, rubbing his chin. He turned to the prosecutor. Did you even bother to look into her past before filing these charges? The prosecutor hesitated. The answer was obvious. The judge sat back, steepling his fingers. I think this case just became a lot more complicated. Evelyn had come to court to defend herself. Now it seemed she was about to expose something much bigger. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Judge Matthews stared at the prosecutor, waiting for an answer. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, flipping through his files. Your Honor, I wasn't aware of Ms. Walker's history with the property, but that doesn't change the legal standing. Judge Matthews raised a hand, silencing him. It changes everything. He turned back to Evelyn. You said the funding disappeared. Do you know what happened? Evelyn exhaled, her voice steady. One day, the city stopped supporting us. They said there wasn't enough money to keep the shelter running. But that was a lie. The judge's brow furrowed. A lie? Evelyn nodded. Not long after the shelter closed, the city approved a budget for a new corporate development project. Millions of dollars. They had the money, but they chose profits over people. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor's face paled as the weight of Evelyn's words settled. One of the officers who had arrested her shifted in his seat. Is that true? He murmured to his partner. Evelyn continued, her voice unwavering. They shut down our home and left us on the streets. I tried to fight it. I wrote letters, met with officials, but no one cared. We were forgotten. Judge Matthews glanced at the prosecutor. Did your office investigate this before pressing charges? The prosecutor hesitated, then shook his head. We followed standard procedure. The judge scoffed. Standard procedure? You arrested a veteran without understanding the full picture. Evelyn sat tall, her eyes burning with quiet strength. I didn't trespass. I was mourning what was stolen from us. Silence filled the room. Even those who had judged Evelyn before were beginning to see the truth. The judge leaned back. Miss Walker, I think we need to look deeper into this matter. He turned to the prosecutor. I want a full review of the city's actions regarding that shelter. The prosecutor swallowed hard. Yes, Your Honor. Evelyn had come here expecting to defend herself. Instead, she had ignited something much bigger. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Whispers filled the courtroom as the judge's words settled in. Evelyn sat motionless, her heart pounding. Was justice finally on her side? The prosecutor cleared his throat. Your Honor, with all due respect, this case is about trespassing, not city funding. Judge Matthews narrowed his eyes. Are you suggesting we ignore potential corruption? The prosecutor hesitated. No, but the judge cut him off. Then I suggest you start digging. The tension was thick. A reporter sitting in the back of the courtroom scribbled frantically in his notebook. This case had just become something much bigger. Then a voice rang out. Your Honor, if I may? Everyone turned to see an older man standing up, a man in a sharp navy blue suit. Evelyn's breath caught. She recognized him. He was Senator Richard Calloway. I was on the city's oversight committee when the shelter was shut down, Calloway continued, stepping forward. And I can confirm that Miss Walker is telling the truth. The courtroom erupted in gasps. The judge banged his gavel. Order! The senator turned to Evelyn, his expression heavy with guilt. I remember you, Miss Walker. You fought hard to keep that shelter open, but we failed you. Evelyn's lips parted in shock. You knew? Calloway nodded. The city diverted funds meant for shelters into a corporate development project. It was wrong. He turned to Judge Matthews. I'm prepared to testify that the city knowingly put homeless veterans on the streets for profit. The prosecutor's face drained of color. He flipped through his notes, suddenly looking like a man who realized he was on the wrong side of history. Judge Matthews turned to Evelyn. Miss Walker, it seems your case is far more significant than a simple trespassing charge. Evelyn sat straighter. She had spent years being ignored, dismissed, but now, people were finally listening. The judge exhaled. I'm placing this case under review, and I strongly recommend an investigation into the city's actions. Evelyn's hands trembled. She had walked into this courtroom as an accused criminal. She was walking out as a catalyst for justice. News of Senator Calloway's revelation spread like wildfire. By the next morning, headlines blasted across every major news outlet. City accused of diverting funds from homeless veterans shelter. Whistleblower senator confirms corruption in housing crisis. Evelyn couldn't believe it. After years of being ignored, her story was now national news. She sat in a small diner sipping coffee, watching the morning broadcast. The city officials must be panicking. A man at the counter muttered, "This is going to get ugly." And he was right. By noon, the mayor's office issued a carefully worded statement. "We take these allegations seriously and are committed to transparency. However, we urge the public not to jump to conclusions before a full investigation is conducted." But behind the scenes, city officials were in full damage control mode. "Shut it down," Mayor Grayson barked in his office, pacing. "Discredit the senator, discredit the woman, whatever it takes." The city's legal team scrambled, digging into Evelyn's past, searching for anything that could be used against her. They found an old arrest from years ago, nothing serious, but enough to spin a narrative. Within hours, news anchors shifted their tone. New information surfaces on trespassing defendant Evelyn Walker. Who really is this homeless veteran at the center of the controversy? Evelyn saw the smear campaign unfolding in real time. They were trying to bury her under a wave of doubt. But she wasn't backing down. She turned to her public defender, Rachel. "They think they can silence me. They don't know who they're up against." Rachel smirked. "Then let's give them a fight." The battle for justice was just beginning. The courthouse was packed. Reporters, activists, and concerned citizens filled every seat, while others stood in the aisles waiting for the trial to begin. Outside, protesters held signs that read, "Justice for Evelyn Walker. Protect our veterans, not corruption." Evelyn sat at the defense table, her hands steady despite the storm brewing around her. Rachel, her lawyer, leaned in. "They're going to attack your past, try to paint you as a criminal." Evelyn nodded. "Let them try." The prosecution wasted no time. The city's attorney, Robert Langford, approached the jury with a smirk. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case isn't about corruption or lost funds. It's about a woman who broke the law, a woman with a history of breaking the law." He threw down a file. "Evelyn Walker was arrested for disorderly conduct years ago. She has a record." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Rachel stood immediately. "Objection. Irrelevant and prejudicial." Judge Harrington sighed. "Sustained. Stick to the case, Mr. Langford." Langford continued, pacing. "She was caught trespassing, plain and simple. The law doesn't bend just because someone has a sad story." Rachel stood. "Or maybe, Mr. Langford, the law shouldn't be used to punish innocent people while real criminals steal from veterans." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to call our first witness, Senator Callaway." Gasps filled the room as the doors swung open. Senator Callaway walked in, his presence commanding. He took the stand, looking directly at the jury. "I have proof," he said. "Proof that the city knowingly diverted funds meant for homeless veterans like Evelyn Walker, and I will expose every single person responsible." The courtroom erupted. Langford paled. The mayor, watching from the gallery, clenched his fists. This trial was no longer just about Evelyn. It was about the truth. The courtroom was electric with tension. Cameras flashed, journalists whispered, and everyone leaned forward in anticipation. Senator Callaway's revelation had changed everything. Judge Harrington banged her gavel. "Order in the court. Proceed, Miss Martinez." Rachel stood confidently. "Your Honor, we now have evidence that the city knowingly withheld funds meant for homeless veterans. This isn't just about Evelyn Walker. This is about corruption at the highest level." She turned toward the jury. Evelyn wasn't trespassing. She was taking shelter in a building that was legally supposed to be hers and other veterans. The real crime is what the city did to her. Langford, the prosecutor, wiped sweat from his brow. "Your Honor, this is—" The judge raised a hand. "I think we've heard enough." She turned to the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" A woman in the jury box stood. "We have, Your Honor." She cleared her throat. "On the charge of trespassing, we find Evelyn Walker not guilty." Cheers erupted in the courtroom. Evelyn's eyes welled with tears as Rachel squeezed her hand. But then, "Your Honor," Senator Callaway stood. "I have one more piece of evidence." He held up a folder. "These documents prove that city officials embezzled over $2 million meant for homeless programs. I demand an immediate investigation." Gasps filled the room. The mayor's face turned pale. Langford looked like he wanted to disappear. Judge Harrington nodded. I'll be forwarding this to federal authorities. Court is adjourned. Evelyn walked out of the courthouse into a crowd of supporters chanting her name. Reporters swarmed her, but she simply smiled and looked up at the sky. She was free, and justice had finally been served. Evelyn's story is a powerful reminder that justice prevails when people stand together. What do you think about this shocking courtroom twist? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more eye-opening content. This keeps engagement high, encourages interaction, and boosts video retention. Let me know if you want any tweaks.